Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour Podcast. I'm Andrew Langer, your host. And if you're watching us on our YouTube channel and you haven't hit the like and subscribe and all those good things buttons, go and do that. Leave a comment. If you are watching us on YouTube, you know you can take us with you wherever you go on one of the many fine podcast platforms at which you find all of your other favorite podcasts. Well, please take us with you there as well. Let your friends know, let your family members know, and your family members' friends know all about the Lunch Hour. Very excited to bring on our guest today. Haven't seen him in a few months. We are part of the same coalition of people that deals with tech issues and meets fairly regularly. I've known him for a long time. His name is Taylor Barkley. He's currently the director of public policy at the Abundance Institute. We're going to hear all about what the Abundance Institute is. Previously, he was the director of technology and innovation at Utah State University's Center for Growth and Opportunity. He's been at Stand Together and the Stand Together Trust, where he managed their technology policy portfolio. Also, he's a Competitive Enterprise Institute alumnus. I'm going to want to get his thoughts on the late, great Fred Smith. And he was the Assistant Director of Outreach for Technology Policy at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. I almost was at Mercatus many moons ago there, Taylor. He is originally from Southern California, a graduate of Taylor University with a double major in history and political science. I know it's a long bio there, Taylor, but let's start here because I'm unfamiliar with the Abundance Institute. Is it a new organization? Tell us about it, how it came about, and how you came to be a part of it.
Sure thing. And thanks for having me on the show, Andrew.
Always.
It's great to be here and hang out and chat a bit.
Yeah.
The Abundance Institute, we launched in April. So,
Wow.
No surprise you haven't heard of it. We're brand new on the scene. Half of the staff are based in Utah, the Salt Lake area, and then the other half are out here in the DC area. And we are a mission-driven nonprofit think tank, relentlessly focused on removing barriers that stand in the way of emerging technologies reaching their life-changing potential. So think, Abundance Institute, emerging technology. We work on artificial intelligence and energy technologies in tandem, and that's what we do.
It's funny because I just had a conversation with John Burlaw from CEI. On the
great.
radio.
Yeah.
Yes.
John's great.
John's great people. And we were talking about the legacy of Fred Smith. Not that I want to start on a down note, folks, but as we're recording this, it's about a week and a half after the passing of Fred Smith, who was the founder of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. We talked with Kent Lastman about Fred's legacy a few months ago, just prior to the big anniversary dinner. But one of the things that John talked about was this issue of essentially the moral case for capitalism, and the idea of explaining it to people about the importance of the egalitarian society and innovation helping people, and how we seem to have lost it. Not we, obviously, you and I have not, but in many ways.
Yeah.
Many businesses have lost the thread on how to explain the benefits of what they're doing. That's essentially what the Abundance Institute is carrying on, and talk about that.
Our motivating vision is the historical record. Look at human history. Technological progress has been the centerpiece for improvements of quality of human life, prosperity, on and on the list we could go. Lowering of child mortality rates is like the thing I think about with three young kids. For most of human history, about 50% of kids did not survive to the age of 4, but thanks to technological progress, far fewer children are dying. And I think, on and on we could go with, the air conditioning, food supply, information, education, entertainment opportunities. Like, this is what we're experiencing because of technological progress. And that's
Do you remember, I don't know if this may be you may be too young for this, and I don't want to be ageist here, but there was in the early 2000s, again, Competitive Enterprise Institute, the big thing that we were all watching at the time was something called Homestar Runner. And HomestarRunner.com.
Yeah, I remember Homestar.
Okay, I don't know if you know, but the CEI softball team for a while was called the Burninators.
I love it.
After Trogdor. And the point is, I'm on a Homestar Runner Facebook group recently, and it's gotten very political because everything's gotten political. And someone posted a meme about late stage capitalism.
Okay.
And posting the Malthusian nonsense about carrying costs or carrying capacity. And essentially, they talking about what they call the fallacy of infinite resources. And I obviously, this is not the place to that was not the place to argue about things, but it's what the Malthusians seem to misunderstand is the role that technology plays in our ability to do more with possibly fewer, even if we concede that there are fewer resources out there, the ability to do more with less. Talk about that.
Absolutely. I mean, that is what technology helps us to do. So when we talk about the energy space where we do a lot of our work, we're constantly pushing back against kind of the zero sum fixed pie Malthusian sort of, we're constantly consuming resources. We see this with, energy technologies throughout human history. We are far more efficient as time goes on at producing more energy with less material. And that's why we're excited about, new nuclear energy generation technologies, yes. Big reactors, small modular reactors, geothermal energy. Geothermal is extracting, using the heat in the earth to then turn water into steam to turn a turbine. Theoretically, you don't go down anywhere on the planet, you're hitting heat, you can turn that water into steam. So on and on we can go. But, there is kind of this mentality in our culture that, okay, if we're going to, it's bad to use more energy. But our story is no, we can 10x, 100x our energy generation. And in fact, we need to produce more energy and electricity if we're going to have the prosperity levels that we want to see. And that's why, we've written about this a lot more. I had a recent Examiner piece last month talking about how the election is, a confirmation that America wants to head towards an energy abundant and economic prosperous future.
Well, it goes hand in hand with what Fred used to talk about and the central mission of CEI, and now I guess the central mission of the Abundance Institute as well, which is the only way you can solve the problems that the world faces is by having strong economies. And the only way you can have a strong economy is by having access to inexpensive and reliable energy supplies, isn't it?
That's correct. Yeah, there has been, history demonstrates this. The more an economy grows and the more individuals become more prosperous, energy use increases. The U.S. lately has been an outlier in that our energy has declined, even though GDP has grown. But if we want to see the abundant, prosperous future that, I think the American people voted for President-elect Trump and Republicans in Congress that they want to see, we're going to need to generate more energy. But, our story is we have the means to do it. We just need to clear away some policy barriers that stand in the way of generating. And this is not even, the fossil fuel, discussion necessarily. Fossil fuels absolutely have a role. Natural gas is a much cleaner source than coal, but we have new energy generation tech that can we can have our cake and eat it too, essentially.
Well, which gets us into the discussion, and I want to talk about COSA in a moment, but I want to talk about the precautionary principle because this plays heavily into this in terms of the new technologies. And some of it also is, rent-seeking and guild-style protectionism, right, where you have the folks who have the not the stranglehold, but they have vast market share in terms of the energy space. They are able to gin the regulatory world to keep competitors out. But there's also the issue of the precautionary principle. Talk about how this plays into this. And actually, before you get into this, because let me just say, so in the late 1990s, because boy, I'm that old. I am old. I spent a lot of time debating with people on Usenet. I don't know if you know what Usenet is, but yes, okay. So for those of you who don't know, Usenet was a text-based site of the internet where a lot of the early style debates. It's where, oh, good Lord, Mike Godwin first came up with Godwin's law.
Of course,
at the Arts Institute. But I made a bet with somebody, and this must have been in 1999, and I said that in the next 10 years, we will not have a new nuclear power plant built in America. Mm-hmm. Then it was like a straight bet of it was only like $20, and I, not even adjusted for inflation. The point is, I won that bet handily. This is a problem, and we've now flipped the concept of risk assessment on its head. Talk about protectionism in terms of the energy world, but also talk about this precautionary principle. Explain to our listeners what it is and how that plays into the deployment of new tech, because I think that's a good entree into talking about COSA and AI.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, so we talk a lot about the precautionary principle at the Abundance Institute for both, the AI policy discussions and energy. Precautionary principle is essentially a policy-making framework that says, we need to verify that a new technology is safe for public use, market use before it's deployed. So this would be like a regulatory posture. We need to, and it's kind of, so on the energy side, nuclear reactors. The result of your bet, we have had far fewer new nuclear reactors built in the past 30 years,
Right.
and in the 60s and 70s, and that's mainly because of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's emphasis on safety, which is good, but if you swing too far into safetyism, you can have the negative effects of more expensive energy. We're using energy from less clean sources, or more even energy intensive extractive sources. We see this in the AI debate, especially with advanced artificial intelligence models. There's a discussion that we need to, before a new frontier model is released, we have to verify it's safe. This is the precautionary principle in action. Europe has adopted this posture, and what we're seeing is far fewer AI companies or even just tech companies developed in Europe. And even some Europeans don't even have access to the most advanced models because of European regulations. So there's this dichotomy, US European approaches, where we're seeing this flourishing of technological advances in the US, but not in Europe.
This is actually a perfect segue into something I wanted to talk about, because as we get into the discussion of COSA, when I was doing small business lobbying work, one of the problems we were seeing was big entities. And I always knew when big labor and big government and big business were getting together, the little guy was going to get squeezed out. The attempt to adopt by inference European exposure standards for workplace hazards, right? Which is the idea of Europe sets a particular standard of what we call a permissible exposure level. And rather than go through the whole notice and comment rulemaking here at home, we just adopt those things. And obviously, this is really great for multinational corporations that are doing business in Europe and doing business in the United States. Not so great for businesses here that can't adopt the same kind of levels. And we don't know what the process is. We know the problems that Europe is having. Talk about the issue of the adoption of European style approaches to risk when it comes to things like AI and COSA.
There is a cost. I mean, it's underestimated, and I think a lot of discussions, the cost that regulations that come from a good place can have on the rates of innovation, and even making products and services cheaper, more accessible for consumers. So yeah, with COSA is the Kids Online Safety Act, which is actually a combination of two bills. It's passed out of the Senate, I think in a 91-3 vote, if I recall correctly, and is now before the House. And we're probably talking about this podcast because over the weekend, CEO Linda Yaccarino endorsed the legislation again. By the way, she endorsed it previously in a testimony in the Senate, and then Elon Musk had kind of a response tweet. Priority safety of children is priority number one, and then Don Trump Jr. had another. So kind of this like Twitter storm, that kind of raised its level again. And the Kids Online Safety Act would essentially requires social media companies to adopt a duty of care that their features and products and services aren't causing mental health issues, as well as different components of the bill we can get into. But the thing to keep in mind here again is regulation can have unintended consequences. It can have secondary effects that do chill, in this case, free speech in most instances, and even technological adoption and innovation. I think this would be a law much easier for big tech companies to comply with than upstarts that could upset them and provide new innovative services in the future.
Let's come back to that in a second, because I want to go back to the issue of innovation and the conditions whereby we are allowed to innovate, because there's the issue of prosperity. But when you disincentivize or you create massive barriers to the deployment of an innovative technology, shocker, innovation stalls. One of the things we've talked about, I don't think this is something you guys deal with, but one that I've worked on, which is something called the Bayh-Dole Act, which was a 1980s act, and we won't even get into the attacks therein. But the point is, prior to the Bayh-Dole Act, innovation had become stymied and stalled in America. After that, we had a massive renaissance of innovation. But talk generally, Taylor, about the conditions, the importance of property rights, the importance of eliminating barriers to entry in terms of incentivizing innovation.
Yeah, and I think the Abundance Institute portfolio kind of provides two examples in stark contrast. Energy, technology. Obviously, it's think of it like the infrastructure required to say, build and start a new electricity generation plant.
Yeah.
But there are also policy barriers there, environmental laws, energy generation approval laws, on and on from the local to federal level. Very difficult to innovate, start something new. Even, you talked about too, kind of incumbents and locked in, maybe incumbent interests. We have this monopoly-based utility model in most of the nation that I think, in order to see kind of the energy generation of 2050, we're going to need to upend that and rethink how electricity, is distributed.
Yeah.
And not rely on this monopoly-based model. Whereas on the other hand, the AI portfolio, artificial intelligence is software. So, software is, since, especially with the dawn of the internet, commercial internet, anyone, anywhere in the world has broadcast capability, has the opportunity to create a billion or $1 trillion company.
Hey, listen, hold on. Let me interrupt you for a second.
Yeah.
I probably still have the memo somewhere to David Knott at Reason early on, where I was encouraging him to create Reason Radio at the time, because the technology had come down so appreciably in cost. I'm sorry, Taylor, go ahead.
No, that's a great example because, my wife and I were on a personal podcast. If we wanted to do that, you want to do your podcast in 1950, you'd have to, have a radio broadcasting station, on and on you can go. But now anyone in the world can do this.
Right.
So, you have this kind of contrast, it's constrained by like physics and, moving heavy machinery in the energy case versus like generating software. AI, maybe, to create the most advanced models, you do need lots of computing power,
Right.
lots of energy, electricity to do that. But, with open source AI models, someone could take, say, Meta's Llama 3.3, I think it's up to, and create a tool, an AI tool or service based off of that anywhere in the world. And that's what's so exciting. And I think we see the economic prosperity we have driven by advances in technology, particularly digital technology, because there was not this precautionary principle dominant. It was as Adam Thierer calls it, a permissionless innovation posture.
Where Adam, I got somebody got to get Adam on the podcast at some point in time to talk about these kinds of things. So let's sort of shift over to the other part of this, right? Now we've got the precautionary principle, but then we've got the regulation of speech. And Liz, I am someone. You have kids. I have kids.
Yes.
We've already talked about this, right? There's always a downside to everything. So yes, we have a world in which we can all be connected and we can all say what we want, and someone literally, 10,000, 12,000 miles away can see it. I tweeted out, oh, good Lord. I tweeted out something yesterday, Taylor, about, I watched the HBO Yacht Rock documentary over the weekend.
Oh, interesting.
Oh, it's great. It's fantastic. I'm a huge music buff. I can't play anything, but I love music. I love music documentaries.
Love it.
And found out that essentially Quincy Jones had used the band Toto as the studio musicians for the Michael Jackson album Thriller. So essentially one could make the argument that Thriller was really Toto's fifth album with Michael Jackson doing the vocals and Quincy Jones producing. And I made the mistake of saying that on X or Twitter or whatever. And I don't know, somebody around the world was roundly offended. How dare I say that?
Oh, okay.
As though I was not being incredibly complimentary in all of those cases to all of the talking about the musicianship of. But this is my point. We're all connected in ways that we've never been connected before. And yet there is a downside. And I've seen it with my kids and my kids' friends and my nephews. And so there is this effort. And we also, listen, let's not discount what happens when you lock kids away for 2 years in their rooms and their only available interaction is online. And we're apparently not supposed to discuss the sociological and psychological impacts of that, but we're only supposed to focus on the dopamine effects and the depressive effects that social media can cause. But there's a real inherent danger of turning to government to deal with it, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. And, I've been tracking this issue of, how best policymakers and which we as a culture or society can keep children, teenagers safe online for the past few years, talking to state legislators about this, federal policymakers. And, it's really important in these discussions. So, today we're talking about the Kids Online Safety Act before Congress. They're trying to get, Speaker Johnson, Majority Leader Scalise are saying no because of the free speech concerns, which we can talk about later. But it's important to define what is the problem we're trying to solve. And you've outlined, I think, maybe the mental health concerns, and this is a connection popularized by Jonathan Haidt, Jean Twenge, who say, use of social media can turn an otherwise mentally healthy teenager, can affect their mental health negatively. But and this is a debated topic, and I want to make clear to listeners as I talk, and I'm surprised that this is under addressed, but Jonathan Haidt's perspective, that perspective is not the dominant perspective.
Interesting.
Psychologists, social psychologists, clinicians, child psychologists, you look, the long tail of analysts say it's a much more nuanced, complicated, correlative versus causal effects. So COSA kind of enters the debate here, trying to solve that problem, the mental health problem, by applying this duty of care. In other words, social media companies can be sued by state's attorney general if they, a user is able to connect their, say their teenage son or daughter and their negative mental health effects with anxiety or depression or eating disorder to a feature on a social media site. And so the theory here is if this duty of care is adopted, then therefore social media companies will be much safer, and teen mental health instances will become healthier over time.
Right.
And so I think, so the mental health is one category. There's the much more, I would say, severe, tragic, abuse instances.
Right.
COSA is not aimed at those. That is, largely the solution there is providing more resources to law enforcement at a federal state level.
I find it amazing. We are, not that I want to get all social conservative here, but there's so much going on in terms of the world sort of being untethered from objective reality. It's so many other, it's so funny because you guys have kids, you and your wife have kids. We have kids. And it was one of those things where I had a conversation with my wife. Very rarely do I discuss my family on the show, but I'm going to today. And I remember having a conversation with my wife when I may have been even before our second child was born, where I said, listen, if you are trying to parent in a way that doesn't mess up your kids, you've already failed, right? You can do your best, but the bottom line is that there is something, there's too much love, too little love, to this, to that, to other things, some mistake you make at some point in time, some, whatever. The only thing you can do is, you love your kids, you're there for your kids, and you teach your kids how the world works. I mean, in an area in which we are trying to remove the government from being in the parenting world, this seems to be a very heavy-handed result from folks who I think should know better.
Yeah, it is interesting, contrasted with, say, like the school choice movement.
Right.
Not trying to centralize control for, federal or even state level, school education, departments of education. Then over here, it's saying, well, actually, the government does know best when it comes to safety on the internet. And this is, I don't want to undercut anyone's pain. There are teens and kids out there who are really suffering from overuse of social media, but the way to solve that is not this path of the Kids Online Safety Act or age verification or age restriction of social media. There are other complex social problems. I think about bullying in schools. Outlawing bullying in schools. We could pass all the laws we want. It's not going to end it. The whole community has to get involved in this. And to your point, we're going through constantly undergoing shifts in society around the world, in the U.S. cultural context, that we're figuring things out as we go along. And public policy solutions are one kind of tool in the toolbox, but to go for that as let's reach for the heaviest hammer we can find is often going to backfire, as we were saying and have earlier, have unintended consequences on, especially in speech.
But let's talk about that, because in an era in which we know that any kind of interaction between government and these social media platforms can lead to the suppression of speech, I will never forget, the conversation I had. Now, this is not just where CEI was before, which is the great office with the garage door, but the second office, the office before that, at the corner of Connecticut Avenue and K, sitting in the conference room with Michael Grieva having a conversation about, by the way, I love to name drop,
love it.
but Michael Grieva about free speech and about the idea why the answer to speech is more speech. And what Michael said is, well, what you want is the freedom and to have the freest society so that the folks who say the most horrible and hateful things put their hateful ideas out there in big pink neon signs so you can point to them and say, that's not what I believe and I don't want to have anything to do with those people. Or you go and you want to confront them with speech of your own. We've moved away from that in society. Now, and the problem is because there is no longer on the part of the progressive left a love of free speech, and we could get into the reasons why I don't think we need to, but this is yet a tool that can once again be used to silence speech that the predominant political narrative doesn't agree with. Talk about the problems there and talk about what's happened in Europe and the lack of a free speech tradition in Europe and what's gone on there.
Yeah, absolutely. So free speech, bedrock of, American history. It's in our Constitution, Bill of Rights, First Amendment, there for a reason, number one. And, this, economic prosperity, political freedoms, and the Kids Online Safety Act could have an effect, I believe a very negative effect on free speech because of this duty of care provision. So, right. So this would allow, a user to say, okay, again, like my teenage son or daughter has maybe anxiety episodes, and I can connect that reasonably well to a feature that was on, say one of Meta's products, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube is actually the dominant social media platform used by teenagers far and away. And so what, imagine a world, so say this law passes, like what are those tech companies going to do? They're going to probably, they're going to disincentivize speech. They're going to become clunkier to use. It's interesting. The findings in COSA will say, the duty of care provision, things shouldn't be, cause compulsive usage. And it's a weird line between compulsive usage and just like an app that's pleasant to use.
Right. Sure.
And, those fights will occur in court. So in order to avoid all this liability, all this headache, companies are just going to, take more things down. They're going to limit the features available to consumers, making these platforms less intuitive, less easy to use, less speech will be shared. And I think in the long run, this will absolutely have a negative effect. And
listen, I've been there. I mean, on one of the other podcasts that I do, along with Jerry Rogers, who's the editor of Real Clear Policy, during COVID, Jerry at the time was the editor of Real Clear Health. So he was reading everything that was coming across his desk about COVID and the pandemic. And he started talking about what he was reading. We're talking about peer-reviewed stuff. I mean, pure science. And YouTube was taking our videos down because we were countering the prevailing narrative at the time, which, by the way, we now know was accurate. This is a problem. And again, you're right. I mean, this is something that always gets me, and I'm sure, given your history in terms of public policy and the impact of the regulatory state, I'm sure it bothers you. We have a real problem in our society where we create solutions, and I use that term loosely with air quotes, we create solutions to problems that don't actually address the problems, will in fact make the problems worse. And yet because it's nominally, right, we're addressing kids' online safety, people think something's being done when nothing's being done. That's a problem, isn't it? Yeah,
absolutely. I think the ultimate responsibility relies with the caregivers or the parents who are closest to the kids and teens suffering or having an effect.
And by the way, keeping a massive database of records of the identity of kids online, what could possibly go wrong with that? I mean, that's yet right. Another form of insanity here.
Yeah. So, in COSA doesn't require age verification, right. But they do say, for all platforms that know a user to be a minor, that's where the duty of care provisions kick in. And it's like, well, if I'm going to defend myself in court, I'm going to need to have like the best sort of knowledge, like to prove like I'm in my innocence or lack of culpability. So I'm probably going to either I'm going to go one of two ways, or I'm not going to pay attention to any sort of kids stuff, or right. I'm going to swing the other way and start gathering more data on kids and teen users. Right. And I want to say too, on the free speech point, before we get too far, we're talking about this COSA because of the X endorsement or the updated X endorsement, but they did add new language, which I've never seen before, where it says, nothing in this section shall be construed to allow a government entity to enforce based upon the viewpoint of users or information protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Like if you have to say
right
that this bill is not going to like violate the First Amendment, it probably is going to violate the First Amendment.
Right, but you get you to ask it begs the question of, well, did it violate the First Amendment beforehand? Did you know that it violated the First Amendment beforehand? I mean, and as always with these things, the devil's in the details, right? Because it's going to go to an agency to be turned into regulation. And even though we know that under the Loper-Bright decision, we know the agencies don't have the leeway anymore, until that gets changed, right? Or Elizabeth Warren's Stop Corporate Capture Act gets passed, and all of a sudden they do wind up giving deference to agencies once again. When you create vague pieces of language, this is what is harm? I mean, how do we measure harm in this regard? That's a very dangerous place for America to be, isn't it?
Oh yeah, and this reminds. So say COSA passed, I could see a world that's like the frivolous patent lawsuits of
right.
You recall that from about a decade ago. It was a very hot topic, and it still occurs. So here we could see maybe like frivolous social media lawsuits,
right?
Potentially, I think of course there are suffering people out there. They could bring a suit to trying to redress damages, but of course there are going to be actors who are. We're going to fight about the meaning of compulsive use, for example, in court. And that's going to, take years. It's going to cost millions of dollars. And who can actually do it? It's the big tech companies, not the little tech companies. And we're just going to see fewer products and speech out there as a result.
Right. I mean, listen, we know that this is what's the line from the David Mamet movie. I don't need a case. I just need a lawyer. I mean, that's the thing. Yeah. We got this situation happening in New York with the Daniel Penny, the father of the guy who was killed on the subway is now suing him. All of these things. Again, you don't need a case. You just need a lawyer. Let's shift gears because I don't want to take up too much of your time today. On this issue, because we did mention him earlier, you spent some time over at the Competitive Enterprise Institute.
I did.
Talk a little bit about Fred Smith and his legacy, and I don't know, maybe Fred's teachings don't inform your work, and that's entirely. Oh,
they absolutely do.
But
they absolutely
talk
do.
About that.
Yeah, so I spent a year and a half at Competitive Enterprise Institute, was their first ever full-time government affairs officer.
Oh, hold on for a second. By the way, I wish I obviously I don't have a bone to pick with you, but I wanted that job. There was it's so funny because when I left CEI to go and become the regulatory affairs lobbyist at NFIB, we had talked at various points in time. Folks were like, you should come back and do government affairs work. Reason had just created their first government affairs role there. Anyway, so go ahead. You just come on board their first government affairs manager, you lucky dog. So go ahead.
It's a small world, right?
Yeah.
Really enjoyed it. And, one of my first conversations was with Fred. I think, he was coming to the office occasionally. And I remember sitting down in his office just to get the history. CI has such a rich history, going back, to the early 80s, if not before. And Fred, I saw someone in, a eulogy reflection about him. He was talking about the abundance agenda, abundance institute ideas and abundance issues before any of us were.
Right.
Competitive enterprise, that it's in the name. He had so many insightful things to say. He'd been around the block. He had the policy fights. He knew how to communicate ideas with people who were friendly and interactive. I don't know if you can hear my son here pounding on the door.
But that's okay.
But family in action here.
Oh yeah.
And I really appreciated my time at Competitive Enterprise Institute. And
were you there under Lawson or were you there under Kent, or both?
With Kent.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent.
Yeah. Kent Lastman, big fan. Yeah. I like to say he my wife and I run the Kent Lastman fan club.
Fan club, very, very nice. Yeah, we had so much fun talking to him a couple of months ago. So, I mean, I'm not that you didn't need to talk about your wife, but a lot of times when I do this show, and my listeners have heard this, viewers have seen this before. Had I added another podcast to my repertoire, because I do 3, which is crazy. Wow. Nobody should do 3 podcasts. One of them was going to be called Outside Interest. You know him, Lawrence Spywak over at the Phoenix Center.
Course, yeah.
So Larry, he plays blues harmonica. Not a lot of folks know this.
Yes,
I was talking to Larry. I was talking to Jim Neal. I was talking to a couple of folks, and I was like, this is really interesting. Somebody ought to do a podcast where they talk to policy folks and political folks about the things that have nothing to do with their work in public policy and politics. And call it outside interest to sort of humanize, because we can talk about abundance, we can talk about Malthus, we can talk about all kinds of things, but also I think it's important for folks to know that we're not, one-dimensional people. Obviously, I'm sitting here talking about Michael Jackson's Thriller and the relationship of Toto to that.
That's right.
But when you're not doing this work, I mean, you're a dad, you've got a lovely wife who also does policy work as well. But what are you guys doing when you're not working? What are some of your outside interests?
We are raising 3 small kids, 5, 2, and 3 months old.
Wow.
Our prime directive there, parenting these young human beings.
You move away from, when you get to 3 kids, you move away from the man-to-man. You have to switch to the zone defense, don't you?
That's right. And then add in more experience. I felt like better equipped with number 3 than number 1 and even 2.
Right.
So we're raising them. We love traveling. Maybe if you don't know, my wife uses a wheelchair to get around, and we love traveling. Even with that, it makes it a little more complex. We just have to plan a little ahead. With 3 kids and the wheelchair involved. But we did a family trip to Florida a month ago or so, and I want to keep traveling around the states and the world. I like smoking meat in the backyard. That's a hobby I can adopt as a dad. Yeah, I do.
Well, okay, because my brothers and I do competitive barbecue. So,
wow,
yeah. What do you
learn everything from you, Andrew?
Well, no, but what are you working off? Are you using a pellet smoker? Using an offset smoker? Weber
just
kettle
a bigger pellet smoker. Yep.
There you go. And have you tackled the pastrami yet?
No, I have not.
Let me tell you.
I'll call the next podcast. We should talk about pastrami smoking.
Listen, I'll talk to you about pastrami at any point in time. We've done the Texas brisket, and then we've taken the brisket and done the pastrami with it. I'll tell you something. It's funny. So Thanksgiving, we had a bunch of people over, and I decided to make the second turkey. I was originally going to do it on the Weber kettle grill, doing something called the charcoal snake method, which is where you build a snake of charcoal on the bottom of your Weber kettle grill, and you light one end, and it gives you, because there's a fire. But I think I finally cracked the code on my offset smoker, which is my brother has the pellet smoker. I have the offset smoker.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, we should talk more about this. But that's another hobby that Rachel enjoys cooking too, and we're a good team.
There you go. It's exciting stuff. Well, listen, how do folks find out more about the good work you are doing at the Abundance Institute?
Our website is easy to remember, just abundance.institute. We're on all the social platforms as well. I run a newsletter.
Hold on. Time out for a second.
Sure.
Again, to interrupt, because this is what I do. When did the .institute come out? When did that happen?
I'm sure it's been around, with these domain names.
Yeah.
I think it just became popular kind of, as .coms and .orgs were taken, people had to get a little creative. But you could do, all sorts of topics going, and it's just a little less intuitive, but it's cool to see it popular.
I may have to go and get regulation.institute. I think that
you could probably.
That's good stuff. So I'm sorry. So abundance.institute is how you find it.
Yep. And then we also run newsletters on Substack. We have a AI newsletter, tech newsletter. We also have an energy newsletter. My colleague, Josh Smith, who's our energy policy lead, he runs that. But, we're on all the social platforms as well, institutional level and individuals too.
Hey, just, real quick, we really have, we run, now listen, I've seen way too many movies, so I know what happens when you've got AI powered dog robots that you're equipping with weapons, but we really run the risk of screwing things up if we come down with a heavy hand of regulation on AI, don't we?
100%. We did some calculations based on, even conservative projections. We could look at, just from generative AI technology, $5,000 to $10,000 more in every American's pocket, just from current levels of generative AI tech. And that's not counting, healthcare, Andrew, vast improvements in healthcare research, healthcare provision. I've been particularly looking at medical transcription error rates, error rates, 8% serious errors in doctor transcription versus about under 1% when AI is involved.
We need to get you to come and brief the Coalition Against Socialized Medicine on that at some point.
Would love to.
That's, and actually we should get you guys to join that. I'll talk to you about that offline in a moment. But no, it's amazing to me. One of the things that I've been pushing for is there's no reason why in 2024 using AI, you can't go online as a business owner, small business owner in America, and enter in a few key pieces of information about your business, location, size, industry you're in, and it can't spit out for you in easy to read language, what you need to be doing to comply with all manner of regulation, if not all of them.
Yes, that's so true. We'll all have that executive assistant in our pocket. And I think the thing I love from a professor at University of Pennsylvania, today's AI is the worst AI you will use. So we have to keep that in mind too.
Yes, I love it. I love that idea. Taylor Barkley, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Andrew.
Our guest has been Taylor Barkley. He is the Director of Public Policy at the Abundance Institute. So glad he could join us today. As I said, listen, if you're watching us on our YouTube channel, go and check us out on one of the many fine podcast platforms that are out there. If you're listening to us, you can check out what we're doing in studio. Check out the Federal Newswire's YouTube channel. We also have other podcasts as well. The Business of America podcast with Jerry Rogers, as well as the China Desk podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. Have a great week, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.